Okay, everyone, so welcome to this, which is our seventh seminar in the PSA MPG seminar series. So we're delighted to introduce Dr. Emily Harmer today. So just to say who I am, for those who don't know, my name's Katie Parry, and I'm going to be chairing the session today. So Dr. Emily Harmer is Senior Lecturer in Media at the School of Communication and Media at the University of Liverpool. We're going to be talking today about her new book, Women, Media and Elections. She's also the co-editor of Online Othering, Exploring Digital Violence and Discrimination on the Web. And she is co-director of Digipol, the Centre for Digital Politics, Media and Democracy. And of course, most importantly, she's also a co-convener of the Media and Politics Group, and we're the ones who organise these seminars. So I'm going to hand over to Emily to introduce the book briefly, and then I have lots of questions for her, and hopefully you'll have some questions as well. Okay, so thanks, Emily.
Okay, as I say, it feels a bit weird being on this side of things. I'm usually the one interrogating or chairing the session. Thanks everyone for coming along to hear me talk about my book, which, as Katie said, is called Women, Media and Elections. And basically it's been a long time in the making. A lot of it started with my PhD, which I've now updated. So it's been a long process of looking at this stuff. But basically what it does is analyses a century of British general elections, looking specifically at how women are represented. So we start in 1918, which is the first election where women are allowed to participate either as candidates or as voters. Some women were allowed to vote in 1918, and then it ends in 2017. Which was a sort of bonus election. I thought it was going to end in 2015, but then obviously we had the snap election. And I'm very glad we did in a way, because it allowed me to have another election with a female prime minister, which sort of inspired the fifth chapter of the book, which I'll talk about in a second. So yeah, the book basically is divided into different sections. So I've got a chapter on women as candidates, women as voters, women as relatives or spouses of male politicians, and also the final chapter, as I said, is about women as political leaders. So the book basically traces how these women, the different roles they play, are represented across 27 elections, I think it is. And I've looked at basically 5 British newspapers which have been around for the entire time. Some newspapers came and went, but these ones were the same ones. So basically I've done a kind of content analysis, looking at the ways in which coverage is gendered, whether women have a voice, that kind of thing. But also there's quite a lot of qualitative work in there, looking at, the kind of way in which women are described or talked about. And these two things kind of play an important role together to get a kind of more rounded picture of what's going on, because sometimes the quantitative trends don't always reveal as much of the detail as you'd want, and then sometimes qualitative stuff isn't as adequate enough to kind of tell you what the kind of broader trends that are going on are. So yeah, basically that's it really, in terms of an overview of the book, but hopefully Katie will have some questions for me, and then we can open it out to other people to kind of maybe dig into some of the findings from this pretty massive study that I've somehow managed to make into a book now.
Yes, a massive study. It's such a lot to take on, that 100 years of elections, and as you say, 27 elections, and to look across 5 newspapers as well for each of those elections. And so you've mentioned this briefly, but what I particularly liked about the book is looking at women in politics very broadly. So not just looking at politicians, but looking at those distinctions between candidates, female relatives of politicians, female voters, and female political leaders. And I guess I've got some questions on each of those that we can talk about. And I think as well, looking at those different roles for women, it is so important to see the full picture of how women in politics are represented in the media. And especially, I would say as well, that focus on voters, which I think, you know, the voters and citizens, audiences, they're always, I think, you know, the poor relation in a lot of these kind of studies. So the fact that, you know, you're paying attention to how voters are represented in electoral politics is, I think, really, really interesting as well. So one of my first questions is, you mentioned obviously the historical perspective. And I think, again, when people talk about, particularly around gendered representations in politics, they kind of make assumptions about changes and how things were in the past. And so I just wondered if you could talk about the main insights that you get from taking this historical perspective, and also perhaps especially where you were surprised by some of the findings.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good question. Yeah, I think the point about taking historical, the reason I did it was because a lot of the scholarship in this area, well, a lot of it's about the USA to start with, but also a lot of the scholarship in this area is very kind of looks at the 1990s onwards. So it's very much people analysing elections as they've happened. And, you know, the kind of earlier studies looking at this don't really go very far back. So we kind of get these sort of trends, you know, the idea that women are, particularly women politicians, are kind of, we're focused on what they look like rather than their political messages and all that kind of stuff. These things have become established because that's what was happening in the 90s. But I thought it was important to have a look further back to see, you know, where did this come from? Has it changed? Because, you know, obviously a lot has happened in that time politically, but also in terms of changes in the press and media, you know, the way the press engages with politics and kind of talks about politics has changed a lot in that time. So, yeah, I think I wanted to sort of fill that in. And I think with women as well, when you're taking a kind of gendered point of view, it's much, you know, there's a starting point that is obvious, 1918, you know, when they first get to participate. So it kind of felt like a good place to start. So I could have a look at, you know, the first 100 years of women as political representatives. And then, as you notice, you know, as you said in your kind of comments there, the fact that no one talks about voters, you know, how are voters represented, let alone, you know, how are women voters represented? And in some ways, that was one of the most interesting aspects of the study, because there was a huge amount about voters that remained starkly the same for a huge period of time. So, for example, you know, we get this kind of stereotyping of women voters very early on as mothers and as housewives, I guess you'd say, and that's the word that they use a lot. So it's women are focused on politics because it affects their children, but they're also very much focused on the cost of living. And the cost of living is a huge theme that they become associated with basically from the beginning all the way up into the 1970s. Women are positioned as being concerned about prices and the cost of living. And obviously makes me wonder, given the current cost of living crisis, whether this will be something that will be re-emerging in the next election, whenever that might be. So yeah, the sort of continuity around voters was something that I found particularly surprising, actually, given the kind of huge changes that women's lives have been over the course of so many decades. Another thing that I think is particularly surprising looking at women politicians is the extent to which early coverage is actually quite welcoming, if that's the right word. So there's lots of discussion about how it's important to have women's voices to reflect those concerns about prices and about kind of motherhood. So it's very in gendered terms saying that it's good to have women participating, but it is, you know, generally quite positive. And then as time goes on, coverage about women politicians becomes much more hostile, particularly in the last 30 years, I would say, whereby, you know, I don't know quite why this happens, but coverage becomes, you know, this sort of stuff that we, you know, the more adversarial stuff that we imagine now, where you're kind of hearing kind of harsh criticism, a lot of which is gendered, around, you know, assuming uncaring and that kind of stuff. If you think about the Maybot stereotype, obviously about her being robotic, but also has very real gendered undertones around her being kind of lacking visible femininity and that kind of thing. So yeah, it surprised me that while sexism featured actually in the coverage, a lot of the early coverage was actually recounting experiences of sexism that women were coming up against at hustings and stuff. So there's a quote that I really liked. I should have put it on a slide, really. That was basically saying, you know, one of her male candidates was saying that, why is she coming to Parliament? Because she should be at home looking after her children. And then the female candidate responds by saying, well, you know, it's precisely because of my children is the reason that I'm seeking to be elected to Parliament, because, you know, our future matters and that kind of stuff. So a lot, you know, it's very supportive, saying, you know, they're facing sexism, whereas much later, the source of the sexism seems to become the press itself, which again might be contrary to what we might think. You know, you might assume earlier coverage would be a little bit more unwelcoming to women politicians.
Yeah, I can pick up on that if you like, because I think that's one of something that is, you know, you would think, as I think you write, you know, as women have come out of the private sphere, out of the domestic sphere, you would expect to see kind of this reflected in the media coverage, but this isn't actually what you find. And there was this very worrying kind of sentence or two in the conclusion, where you say, in the latter half of the century, women voters began to be framed as passive beneficiaries of the state's funding concerning health and childcare and other social security benefits. Women voters then are almost exclusively associated with policy areas which emphasize their gender identity and familial roles, which ignores the considerable diversity amongst women and reinforces heteropatriarchal assumptions about women's role in society. So, you know, this really struck me, because it's basically saying, you know, this hasn't improved. You know, if anything, like you say, it seems to have got worse. And then coupled with the kind of hostility and sexism that we see for politicians as well. I don't know if you want to say more about that.
No, I think that's right. And I mean, that's the other story. So at the end, where I was saying that, you know, they're kind of framed as being worried about the cost of living up until the 1970s. After that point, which if you think about it, you know, we get our first female party leader in the 1970s who becomes Prime Minister in 1979. And just as, you know, women are reaching that sort of levels of power, conversations about women voters and ordinary women are kind of retreating back into the private sphere, as you say. So we get lots of discussion about how women are the users of services that are being cut, for example. So there's loads of stories, particularly actually during the Thatcher years in the Daily Mirror, where it's very focused on, you know, this woman couldn't get, you know, was on a waiting list for a long time, and that her child was, you know, or, you know, childcare is inadequate and stuff. But it's very much about, women as kind of beneficiaries of the state. Whereas, you know, previously women were actually, I guess they were kind of quite active, because they were the ones badgering politicians about the price of this, that, and the other. The other thing that's interesting about that is because it's almost contradictory. So over the time, women's actual voices, i.e. women voters who get quoted, that rises over time. So in this latter period, the 80s, 90s, and into the 21st century, you get more direct quotes from women. However, they kind of seem more passive and kind of depoliticized, even though they're kind of given an actual voice. Whereas earlier, you didn't hear from them directly, but they were very much in a presence of, you know, women were there, or you would get lots of readers' letters, which you don't really see as much these days. There were loads of really interesting readers' letters from the 1950s and 60s talking about why they were going to vote, and the things that they cared about in their own words. I mean, obviously they're edited, but so that really declines. So you get women speaking, but they tend to not be talking about policy. So it was just saying, oh, I couldn't access this service, or childcare is a pain, or I can't balance my work life with my all that kind of stuff. There's not enough going on. So I think, yeah, I think it is quite, well, worrying, but also just really interesting that some of the changes in the press are actually kind of pushing the kind of passivity that way, as much as it is about the kind of actual experiences of women having changed, if that makes any sense.
Yeah,
I'm sure it did.
No, it does. And the other, sorry, I know we've got a couple of questions, and do please also add your questions as well. But I just wanted to quickly say, because it's linked, that you also, when it comes to politicians' spouses, note that, again, earlier in the century, they actually talked about political issues and were engaged politically, and that was what was reported, whereas later on, it's actually more as that symbolic representation to support their husband's credibility. So again, we see that sort of slightly worrying shift in terms of in terms of their voice and their agency.
Yeah, I think the spouses or relatives, because early on they are more diverse range of relatives, but later coverage does become very focused on the spouses of party leaders in particular. But yeah, the relatives are really interesting, because it sort of seems, and I put this in the book, this is kind of an odd thing to include, I think. It's not what you expect to see politicians' family members discussed rather than actual politicians. But they do tell us a lot, I think, about how politicians and political leadership is perceived as very masculinized to start with. But also, yeah, this as you emphasize, the fact that early on they are very much in the public sphere, speaking at hustings, giving political speeches, skewering other male, other politicians, and for saying, what, kind of basically doing everything that you would expect a politician to do. And this is, it kind of shows really that, I mean, I don't know how well people know this, but the first 3 women MPs, for example, were both the spouses of the former MP. So it kind of shows that embeddedness of how, women as couples, sharing political views and that kind of stuff, it kind of really fed into, and they were seen as sort of less dangerous, I guess, than other women, because they weren't seen as this feminist vanguard who were trying to come into parliament and change things. They were a safe pair of hands because they'd been immersed in the sort of informal aspects of party politics for decades alongside their family members. So I think that, and then, the shift away from that and towards more private sphere concerns with wives is really interesting, and reflects that broader personalization of politics, around saying, I'll be a good MP because I've got these credentials, and, your family becomes part of those credentials. So yeah, again, I hadn't really, thought about that as a kind of pacifying thing, but I guess, it is, particularly in the later years, during the 90s, when coverage about women who are married to politicians becomes particularly hostile. Glenys Kinnock, Cherie Blair are seen as these kind of dangerous women who are wanting power for themselves, rather than, just these kind of women that you then get later where they're seen as supportive and trying to just boost their husbands or whatever. But yeah, let's
Yeah, okay, Antel's been extremely patient with me. So we've got a question from Antel, and then a question in the chat from Mercy, and then Fiona. Thanks.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Katie. Thanks, Emily. I haven't read your book yet. I will. And I do find it very interesting indeed, this form of backsliding that you describe that took place especially during the 1990s. And I know you can only, guess about, what's behind that. And that was probably, not really within the remit of your study. I'm going to get to a question that just kind of needs a bit longer to get there. I just thought about it. It's interesting that we often see that in various contexts when it comes to, let's label it progressive politics, right? That there's always a kind of counter movement to that rearing its head after a while. Whether that's racial politics, the sequence of US presidents is just a kind of very telling case in point. Or, we all would have thought that we are farther ahead in terms of trust in science and compassion and being considerate human beings, and then the COVID pandemic hit and that happened. We have democratic backsliding across the world and all of that. So just an idea, and then now a question kind of to you. Could that be kind of either part of a larger trend of kind of the backsliding, kind of regressive moves in our politics and political culture a few decades after the end of the Second World War, indeed? Or are you actually kind of, have you kind of maybe even found or found an indicator of almost like a universal law of progressive politics, meaning that there's always a phase of you go 2 steps ahead, right, with something, and then you go at least 1 step back, if not all 2, and that this also happened not just with the racial politics here and other things, or the trust in science and politics, but also when it comes to women in politics in the UK. Do you have any notions of these kind of larger, let's say, cycles of progression versus regression in politics?
Yes, thank you for the question. Yeah, that's really important, actually, the sort of cyclical nature of it. I kind of have, in the summary, slightly lose a lot of the nuance that's in there, but in the book. But yeah, basically, the point is that there comes cycles with this stuff. So, for example, with women politicians, they're more likely to be quoted in that immediate post-war period than they are now. But at the same time, there are more of them now, so they are more likely to be covered, if that makes sense. So it's kind of like there are cycles to the positive coverage and the negative coverage. But so I suppose that basically underlines the reason why I wanted to look at the historical perspective, because there's no such thing as progress in a way. It sometimes does. It is, as you described, sometimes 2 steps forward and then 1 step back when something happens. Particularly, I think, around moments of political crisis, or some of the kind of post-Thatcher 1990s politics, I think, is particularly interesting from a gendered point of view, because we didn't even have a sniff of a woman leader, other than Margaret Beckett, who was interim Labour leader for a short period of time after John Smith died. There was no sign of a woman on the horizon, and then we kind of get this unexpected woman in the form of Theresa May later on. So I do think you're right that it's kind of, there may be a little element of backlash in there as well, but I do think that's why looking at this longer picture is quite important, I think, because sometimes if you look at something for 20 years you think there's a trend, but if you go further back, there was this other trend that led to this trend that might come back again. And I think the wives are a good example of that, actually. So they're very political, then they're not political, and then they become political again, but in a completely different way, i.e. the political wife is rejected later when they were embraced earlier for various reasons. And there's no escaping, actually, the role of partisanship in the press in Britain is huge, is a huge spectre in this whole thing as well, which obviously intensifies at certain times. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's funny actually, because that's exactly the word I wrote down, partisanship, that I was going to ask you about. But Mercy had a question about the gender of journalists. Did you also look at the gender of journalists?
Yes. So it's not in the book, Mercy, sadly, because basically it's a really interesting question, and I have got the data for this, but I've never been able to really make much of it because of press conventions, basically. So the first 50 years or so, having explicit bylines was not a thing. Most of the media coverage is kind of, there's no byline, or there's basically a reporter or something kind of euphemistic. So so I have got data for later years when obviously, it becomes more of a convention to have women, to have names, to name the journalist. But yeah, because I couldn't track it the whole way, really, it was, I've never ended up including it in the book, because it would have felt a bit odd to have it only for the last sort of 50 years or so. But I have got the data, so it is something that I was thinking about including, but again, it's just sort of never really fit with the rest of the pattern of the book. But yeah, there are more women obviously now than than earlier on.
Did you want to come
back? Was that a follow-up?
Yeah, is that a follow-up, Mercy? You need to unmute.
Yeah, follow-up. Thank you. Did you notice any shifts from the beginning when women were given credit in coverage? I'm asking because my own work and what I've noticed is that women journalists seem to be really determined to show that they are very tough on female politicians because they don't want to be considered to be weak and wimpy, and they're more aggressive and not very supportive of women politicians. And I don't really have an explanation for that. So I was just wondering if you noticed a similar pattern.
Yeah, no, I mean, I haven't looked at it in a systematic way, sadly, yet. But what my main kind of thought about it when I was trying to wrangle with it was actually it didn't really make a difference. So, we kind of have these ideas that if we have more women journalists, then women are being more normalized in politics, and therefore you might get less sexist coverage. But from, the main thing that I picked up was that actually, the socialization as a journalist, I guess, into the kind of language of your paper and your kind of newsroom seemed to be stronger than actually any effort to try and combat, historical sexism or that kind of thing. Again, I haven't looked at it systematically, but that was my overarching thing, was that I couldn't really see any difference, which was a bit of a shame.
I guess as well, just from sort of memory of studying election campaigns, is you often have those articles that are written by a few different journalists as well, because they're kind of bringing. So it's often you're coding for gender would mix, so it can be quite difficult sometimes as well, just because of the conventions again of political journalism. James,
so I'd have a mixed category for that.
Yeah. Sorry, James.
Hi. Hello, everyone. That's absolutely fascinating, as I knew it would be. I mean, I'm glad I managed to wangle my way in at the last minute today, having not properly read the newsletter the other day. I'm dragging you back to the cycles again briefly, the continuum versus the cycles, if you like, or the continua that you've observed, and just particularly with relation to women voters. You kind of mentioned this trope, this sort of housewife trope, kind of running through, or periodically resurfacing, maybe bubbling away in the background all the way through, even up to the present or to the recent past, which is really interesting. And I was just thinking in class last week, where we were looking at some historical clips, and I was looking at Ramsay MacDonald in like 1929 through one of his broadcasts appealing to the public to vote for the national government in the face of the Great Depression and the crash and everything. And he directly addresses you housewives repeatedly in it. It's very, very pointedly geared towards women who obviously relatively recently in some cases at least, had got the vote at that time, you know. And then later the same day, we went over to the US and we were looking at Nixon in his Chequers speech 30 odd years later, again directly talking to housewives and women who manage the budgets and in the household and so on. And I just wondered, with that, you referring to the portrayals of women politicians, you were saying that there sometimes seem to be a bit of a coincidence with you know, background events, economic events maybe that were happening at particular times where particular sort of discourses bubble to the surface or whatever more markedly. And I wonder whether with things like the housewife thing, does that tend to turn up in periods of economic crisis even more visibly, for example, or are there any other kind of correlations that you notice with that particular trope?
Well, I mean, when, you know, talking about the inter and post-war years, when wasn't there an economic crisis? So I think that's partially why the housewife kind of stays as a kind of figure to be called out. I think, yeah, I mean, there's a whole lot of that language around managing the household budget, you know, and I suppose slightly patronizing women in the sense that they're kind of saying, you know, of course women understand the economy because they understand what the pound can buy at the shops and that kind of stuff, as if household budgets run the same as, you know, national government budgets kind of thing. And I think some of that is also, as you say, it's very much a reflection of party political appeals at the time towards women. And I mean, again, it's not something that I had space for in the book, but I remembered in the early years of studying it, looking at kind of posters in particular, obviously had more of a thing back in the day, looking, you know, basically invoking this kind of housewife figure. I think also interestingly, I'm not sure this actually is answering your question, but it's an interesting connected issue, is that, you know, early on women, the thought of including women in politics in general was seen as a good thing because it was helping to incorporate, to educate the new woman voter. So this is why I think a lot of the spouses of politicians were kind of tolerated in political spaces, was because they were seen as being able to speak the language of the housewife, and they could put it in terms that women could understand, was the sort of the way in which the papers described it anyway. Obviously that might not be, you know, parties hopefully had a better understanding of what of their voters than the press. But yeah, so I think, as I said, you know, when is economic crisis not happening? You know, there's a lot of stuff in the 1950s elections, of which there were, you know, four actually, yeah, around, you know, the end of rationing, you know, women kind of basically saying this is, so yeah, basically they're consumers for a long period of time, really up into the 1970s, where again you've got, you know, devaluation and stuff like that, making prices a kind of electoral issue. And one of my favourite quotes actually from, I think it was 1970, is from the Daily Mirror, referring to Ted Heath, is saying, do the voters think, do they think voters are thick in the head that the price of bread under Ted, like it's this whole kind of ridiculous pseudo poem about, you know, prices, and, you know, Ted Heath not having a clue because he didn't have a housewife of his own, being the slightly unpleasant undertone of that. But yeah, sorry, again, I've gone off on a tangent, James, but yeah, housewives are kind of, I guess, because the economy is the main thing. Again, I don't know if this is surprising or not. It doesn't surprise me anymore, but it did at the time. That the economy is the most major issue that is associated with women voters for most of the century, even though we might not think of it as a kind of feminized issue, but obviously it is in this way. Sorry, randomly tangential there. So, but thank you for the question.
I think please do add your questions if you like, either in the chat or raise your hand. Just to kind of pick up on that actually, because I think that's another key thing that's written about in relation to women in politics, is whether they are only associated with certain issues and certain policies, the sort of soft politics, or like you say, feminized issues. But did you actually find that in the study in terms of politicians? Because I think
in terms of politicians, no, not at all. That's one of the things that I looked for, because it was a huge pronounced issue in the American literature, is that, you know, women candidates, again, different political systems, so obviously they campaign in a different way. But one of the things was, yes, that women kind of tend to do better with so-called, anyway, feminized policy areas, you know, healthcare, education, those kinds of feminized areas. But this is absolutely not borne out in the UK case. Women politicians, when they're actually described as talking about politics at all, which is, you know, policy at all, which is not very often, sadly. But I think that's also, lots of men politicians are not talking about politics in a lot of these this coverage either. Sorry, policy. I keep saying politics, but you know, I mean policy. So yes, no, it wasn't. Women when they're talking about policy, they are, you know, addressing the full range, you know, the economy, foreign policy, everything, you name it. There was no kind of, I didn't notice any kind of gendering of that, which in a way is good, you know. It's kind of demonstrating that women are at home in the kind of in talking about any kind of policy issue. At least that's normalized in the press.
No, it is surprising and really interesting, and like you say, a real difference to the American based literature. Fiona?
Hello everyone. I'm glad to make it along, and hello Emily. I've not managed to make it to the last few, so I'm really happy to make it today. So again, just feeding off of a lot of the other comments and discussion, this idea of women politicians favoured in times of crisis as this kind of feminized kind of, but you've got two leaders now. You've got women in quite similar political backgrounds in the sense in your corpus, and I wondered what kind of things that you were seeing, or similarities or differences with your other groups of women when the leaders were in place. So with your voters and your spouses, was that radically, were you kind of seeing it a kind of reverse, or were you seeing different kinds of trends when they were in power, and what kind of things did you notice about that personally?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, no, that's a really good question, because the main thing about when we have a female leader, particularly the Prime Minister, obviously, as you can imagine, they take up a lot of room in the press. But when we have female party leaders, it basically means that other women's voices are kind of dropped dramatically. So they basically take up all the space. It's almost like there's a finite amount of space for women. And if you've got a female politician who is a leader, then it's all about her rather than kind of all of the other women as well. So particularly, I mean, this is the case particularly in the 80s, obviously, if you think about, whilst the, you know, we have vastly more women MPs now, but in the 80s, you know, it's all about Thatcher, and there's very little actually about women voters or other women politicians kind of in there, and this kind of repeats a little bit. Kind of. It's also interesting because when we have a woman leader, it doesn't really normalize other women in politics. So I've kind of, in the last chapter, I just look at the elections where we have women party leaders. So not just May and Thatcher, but also, you know, 2015, where we, you know, the presence of other leaders, whether they are in the UK Parliament or not. For example, you know, Nicola Sturgeon, etc. And Clyde, you know, Natalie Wood and people like that who were in the press at the time, even though they weren't in the UK Parliament. And you find, that leaders basically take up all the space, and actually coverage of them is not as gendered as coverage of ordinary women politicians. So you get this sort of weird situation where, you know, it's almost normalizing women in power, but at the same time, it only really the beneficial things of it not being sexist or, you know, as gendered coverage only really happens to the most elite women. The rest of the backbenchers or the other candidates still receive much more kind of gendered stuff. So it's almost like this kind of, you know, there's, I could come up with some, so I think I called it a kind of stop valve or something. It's almost like the progress happens for the woman who gets the furthest, but then when, you know, those behind don't benefit from that normalization, which is frustrating, I guess, to say the least. But yes, I mean, basically, when there's a woman leader, everybody, no one else gets a look in, and which is pretty, you know, it's not ideal, let's say.
Thanks, Emily. And Mercy, did you have a question?
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Thanks, Emily. I was just thinking, you talked about women voters. What's the relationship between women voters and women politicians? Because if you look at the American case, some of Hillary Clinton's critics, very strong vocal critics, were women. And I've noticed in some other settings that women seem to be more critical of women politicians. It's almost, yeah, we're ready to have a female president, but she's not the one. And you want to ask, you know, choosing between Trump and Clinton, you really think that Trump is a better choice? So is there any clear pattern of women and their support or maybe dislike for female politicians?
Yeah, well, just because I'm looking at press coverage, it's more about impressions, I guess, rather than actually knowing what women thought of women politicians. But in both cases, actually, so in the chapter on women candidates, I call them, because obviously they're in elections, so none of them are MPs yet. There's a real strong current that goes across that they're very much talked about as though they are representing women. So their kind of role as gendered representatives is very much kind of present in the press across time. Even, you know, in more recent elections, that idea that women represent women in a way that, you know, they would never speak about male politicians representing men, is a real kind of strong undercurrent. I didn't really pick up on women's voters talking about women politicians, actually. There aren't, as I say, you know, their voices increase over time, but when they are speaking, it's always about their own experience. It's not really they're not really commenting on women politicians. You get the odd comment from a male voter saying, this woman, you know, one of them, I can't remember the exact election, and which constituency, but there's one thing where there's two female candidates from the two biggest parties, and one of them, you know, one of the colour quotes that they put in to kind of give a sense of colour to the article is that this man saying, well, there's not much to pick between them because they're both women, you know, so it's this, so you get that sort of thing, but there's never really an explicit, you know, nobody asks women voters what they think of women politicians, and they don't volunteer it in my sample, which I suppose is actually quite interesting, that there's, you know, they're not linked in that way, but there is an expectation that women politicians will represent women voters, but the connection between them isn't made by the women voters themselves.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's interesting, and like you were saying, you know, men aren't seen to represent men, and of course there isn't any academic literature that's about men, you know, only representing men either. So it just sort of shows this kind of normalization and the default idea of the masculine space. I was just going to ask, I know this isn't in the book as such, but obviously you have written about social media as well, and particularly the kind of the othering and harm and abuse that can appear on social media. So I just wondered if you see these shifts, some of these shifts towards hostility and sexism, is this, do you consider this to be kind of in interplay with the development of social media as well.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that Ros and I talk about a lot, actually, that the whole kind of hybrid media theory of, you know, how mainstream press can actually sometimes cause online pylons about women politicians. So yeah, this is something that Ros and I want to write about. So you've preempted a future paper. But yeah, basically, I think it is, you know, if we think about how we use social media, a lot of it is about sharing but, you know, legacy media coverage on social media. So yeah, I think those sorts of stereotypes that appear in the press can quite easily get taken up by, you know, people who want to cause trouble online, or just people who are kind of just horrible sexists or whatever, can, you know, use those as a reason to kind of attack people. So yeah, it is a real interplay. I mean, it's interesting kind of in terms of elections and election coverage. I mean, again, Mike, I haven't looked at this yet in a great deal of detail, but if you think about a lot of that stuff around Theresa May, for example, with the May bot, a lot of that stuff was from online. You know, there was a lot of people making comments about her that then made their way into the press as much as the other way round. So I do think we have to, you know, it is a difficult environment now, an extra complication, I guess, that you're kind of having to negotiate those relationships with journalists when you're talking about politics and trying to represent people, but also, you know, the social media and the kind of meme makers of this world, those sorts of people who are kind of not necessarily engaging on the same terms as you. You know, it's all about, it's not always in good faith, or it's because they find it fun. It's not necessarily like an attack, but it can turn into one. So yeah, it is something that, you know, makes it more difficult, I think, for women politicians at times. Well, we know, I mean, from the research that we've done about kind of the nature of that kind of abuse online. But it's also the more subtle stuff. I mean, this is again something that Ros and I have written about, but, you know, it's not just about outright abuse. There are ways in which people can talk to women politicians online that subtly remind them that they're not quite meant to be there, you know, telling them to shut up and silencing and that kind of stuff, basically telling them to go back to the kitchen. These sorts of things that, you know, would never be flagged as abuse, but are kind of nevertheless problematic and can be, you know, well, just underlines politics as a kind of masculinized space, and it's not as friendly to women as it ought to be.
And yeah, that I think often we kind of focus on those negatives and the abuse and perhaps the silencing. And Ros has mentioned Diane Abbott as an important example, who was the recipient of a large amount of the abuse, I believe. I don't remember if that was 2015 or 2017. Is there any room for optimism in any of this? We've kind of talked about a lot of the trends of being quite concerning. I just wondered in terms of whether that's kind of parliamentary initiatives or media initiatives. Are there, you know, the solidarity that people can get on social media as well? Do you kind of see shifts in the other direction as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, this sort of speaks to some stuff that Ros and I are kind of ongoing doing. I think it depends where, you know, you say online, as it could mean anything. So if you're looking at the Daily Mail online comment section, for example, you know, there's no cause for optimism. You don't need to look for yourself. I'm telling you that there's no cause for optimism there. But, you know, some spaces and platforms have, you know, affordances which don't encourage pylons. So, you know, we've been looking at comparing Instagram, for example, with Twitter and Facebook, and, you know, because people don't really reshare on Instagram, and there's no incentive to try and ratio a politician or to kind of retweet abuse about them or direct someone to them. So, you know, we've just been doing a little study, which I did talk about at the MPG, where we found there was quite a lot of support under posts from women politicians on Instagram saying, I'm so glad you're looking into this, particularly around feminist issues, actually. Some of the posts that I looked at for that were about, you know, explicitly kind of gendered or feminist issues. And, you know, there were lots of women in the comments saying, thank you so much for what you do, which you don't really see on, I'm sure it must exist on Twitter, I don't know, but yeah, so I think, yes, I think, and also, you know, social media means all sorts of different things to different people. So just as we have, you know, hashtags that do good work, like, you know, Me Too, Black Lives Matter, etc., there are also, you know, uses of it that are bad. So I guess it must be it's the same for women in politics. You know, there's pros to being on there. You can present yourself in opposition to some of the stereotypes that you receive in the press, but also, you know, in the full in the knowledge that there might be someone that comes along and wants to be horrible to you any moment, kind of thing. So, yeah, I think there is.
Sorry.
No, I was just going to say, I think there is a way to, you know, I don't think it's all doom and gloom.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking of an example at Tracy Brabin, where she got the criticism for her top being off her shoulder, but then she was really humorous, and the way she dealt with it and got support on social media. You can, like you say, you can perhaps kind of combat some of it, some of the abuse that you get as well, and use it in kind of humorous and innovative ways. Okay, does anyone else have any questions? Coming up to an hour. I did have one small one about, I just wondered whether particular individuals, when it comes to voters, can kind of skew results. So I'm thinking of Gillian Duffy in 2010 and Beryl from Bristol in 2017 as kind of women who might have had quite a lot of coverage as voters or citizens, and whether that can, you know, be quite unusual to have like a single individual that then could be written about quite a lot.
Yeah, I mean, if you thinking back to the Gillian Duffy incident, sparked a lot of this is about timing as well. So I only look at the final week of the campaign in each one, so it kind of depends when the woman emerges, how much press coverage they get. Obviously, if those of you unfamiliar, Gillian Duffy was an ordinary woman who Gordon Brown encountered in Rochdale, was it? And you know, they had a chat, and then he left his mic on and which was from Sky News, and he got in the taxi, and then he was having a go at his aide and basically called her a bigoted woman. And then it caused this whole thing of he had to go back. Well, he didn't have to, but he chose to go back and apologize to her, and it basically kind of hijacked the whole news cycle and became a kind of thing a stick to beat him with, basically, for, you know, implying he was out of touch and all this kind of thing. So those sorts of, and that happened very late, so she does feature a lot in that later election. But as in general, there's not that, until the sort of 90s, 80s, 90s, there's not really that much focus on individual women. It's more kind of women as a group, or women who are, you know, this woman spoke to this person over here at this time. And we don't really get a lot of individual information about those women other than from their readers' letters. So, you know, there are a lot of readers' letters in 1945, for example. The Daily Mirror ran a campaign saying, you know, I'm vote for him, because the election, for those unaware, the election was called for whilst lots of fighting servicemen hadn't been demobilized and hadn't returned to the UK. So they were encouraged to write in and say what you were voting for and why you were voting for your son or your husband or whatever. This wasn't just for women, it was for, you know, older men were writing in about their sons and all sorts as well. But yeah, there was a lot of readers' letters where you get individual detail. But yeah, for the most part, they're kind of like little bit players. So you hear about them not being able to access a hospital, or you hear about the Gillian Duffy incident. So yeah, sometimes it does skew in terms of their sheer presence, but there's not really enough detail in there to kind of make it skew in any other sense other than their presence, if that makes sense, because you just don't know enough about them. they're very like fleeting examples in the news item, and then they're on to the next thing.
Yeah. Okay, well, we're almost at 5 o'clock, so I'd just like to thank Emily so much for this. It's been really interesting, and lots of applause.
Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks everyone for coming. And we're going to have a bit of a break from the seminar series because we've got the main PSA conference in April, and so we'll be in touch after the conference about our next seminar. So I think that's all I need to say. If anyone's got anything to add before we go. Well, goodbye, and thank you so much for coming, and it's really lovely to see you, and especially those that I know.
Thanks,
Katie.